Hello friends, welcome again. Friends, in this video today we are going to discuss the different definitions of lyric, and we will also discuss the origin and development of lyrical poetry in English literature. Friends, in my previous video we discussed that literature is an ancient art. Literature is as old as human civilization, and this literature is written in different forms. We have different forms of literature like drama, poetry, novel, essay, short story, biography, autobiography, travelogues, and so many more. These are the different forms of literature through which the writers, the authors, they express their ideas, their emotions in literature worldwide. But it is believed that poetry is considered as the most ancient form of literature. Friends, if you examine the history of human civilization, if you examine the ancient cultures, then you will find that in those olden times, in the ancient times, one art which was existing, and that was painting, and then the second art which existed in the olden times was the art of writing poetry. Novel, essay, short story, biographies, all these other forms of literature came into existence later in the history of human civilization. But poetry, the art of writing poetry, is considered as the most ancient art when we are studying literature. Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher, he himself has classified poetry into three broad categories. According to Aristotle, there are three kinds of poetry: epic poetry, which is narrative, which is a very long poetry. Then we have dramatic poetry, and the third one, as discussed by Aristotle, is lyrical poetry. Friends, in this video, we will focus our attention mainly on the discussion of this lyrical poetry. We will discuss how lyrical poetry came into existence. We will talk about the origin of lyrical poetry, and then how slowly and gradually this lyrical poetry developed through different ages. So we will also have a look at the development of lyric poetry, particularly in English literature. But first of all, we must begin with the question, what a lyric poetry is. What is the definition of lyrical poetry? So friends, remember, you all are fond of watching movies, right? We all watch movies, Hindi movies and all. So when you watch a movie, in the Hindi movies, after some interval you get some songs, right? Some actions and some songs are presented. Friends, these songs are nothing but lyrical poetry. In Hindi, it is known as Urmi Kavya. So lyric means an Urmi Kavya, right? It is a short poem which has some musical qualities. Lyric is very short in length, which has some musical quality, and it expresses the personal emotions or ideas of the poet. So, if you want to give a precise definition of lyric, then you can say that a lyric is a short musical poem which expresses the personal emotions or experience of the poet. From this definition, we can understand that this kind of poetry is short in length, number one, and it is written in the form of stanzas. These stanzas can be couplets, 2 lines, or tercets, or 3 lines, quatrains, 4 lines, and so on. But lyric poetry is very short in length and it is written in the form of stanzas, number one. Number two, lyric poetry is mostly personal by nature. It is personal by nature, means the poet tries to express his personal emotion or his personal experience in his poetry. So, it is subjective or it is personal, number two. Number three is that every lyric poetry, expresses a single idea or an emotion, right? Lyric poetry, because it is very short, it has not large scope to play, right? So, in a short poem, the poet tries to express one single idea. So, lyric poetry is focused on one single idea. Number four, every lyric poetry must have some musical quality. Why? Because lyric poetry is mainly meant to be sung. Okay? It is meant to be sung, and for singing you must have some rhythm in the poetry. So, musical quality is also an important characteristic of every lyric poetry. Moreover, the last important thing that you must remember when we are discussing the important elements of lyrical poetry, that is the use of poetic devices like metaphor, like simile, and so many alliteration, apostrophe, and all other such poetic devices, right? So, the poets make use of flowery language, they make use of ornamental language, they make use of figures of speech to make their poetry more impressive, more alarming, and more emphatic. So, friends, these are the important characteristics of lyric. The lyric is written in different forms. Lyric can be classified into different types, right? But the most popular types are, as you can see on the screen, they are the sonnet, the ode, the elegy, hymn, and ballad. Friends, what is a sonnet, what is an ode, or what is an elegy, ballad, or hymn? That we will discuss in detail in my next video. But right now you just remember that these are the important types of lyric poetry in English literature. Now, let's come to the main point of how lyric poetry originated in the ancient times. Friends, the word lyric, L-Y-R-I-C, the word lyric itself, comes from the word lyre, L-Y-R-E. This lyre was an ancient musical instrument in Greek culture, right? In the ancient Greek times, classical times, as you can see this picture of the lyre on the screen. Lyre is a kind of a musical instrument with some strings in it, or you can imagine today's guitar. In today's times we have a musical instrument called a guitar, right? So the same kind of an instrument with some strings was existing in the ancient Greek classical times. So lyric poetry actually originated in those times, and it was called lyric poetry. Why? Because this kind of songs were sung in the company of a lyre. The picture you can see on the screen, okay? Because they were sung in the company of this lyre, that's why they were known as lyric poetry or lyric songs in the ancient times. The Greek poet Pindar, Pindar, the Greek poet Pindar was a very famous lyric poet in those times. And in the ancient times, in Greek literature, two kinds of lyric poetry was written and was sung in those times, right? And these two types are choral lyrics. Choral lyrics means sung by chorus. Chorus means a group of singers. At the same time, 5 or 10 or sometimes 15 singers come together and they sing together. That is known as a chorus. And this kind of a poetry, the song which was sung by the chorus in group, was known as choral lyric. And another kind of a lyric which was existing in those times was monody. Mono means one. Monody means a song sung by a single person. Okay, so friends, remember, two kinds of lyric poetry existed in the ancient Greek literature. Number one, choral lyrics, and number two, monodies. Okay, these choral lyrics sung by a group of singers, they were usually performed at some public places on some religious occasions, right? And monodies were performed in some private gatherings. Okay, so choral songs sung by a group of singers, they were sung on some religious occasions in public, and monodies sung by a single singer, they were sung in some private gatherings. The common themes of lyric poetry in the ancient times were love, desire of something. Desire means wish, okay? Desire of something, suffering, sometimes war, sometimes patriotism. These were the common themes on which the ancient lyrics, both choral and monodies, were written. And in the ancient Greek times, Sappho, Sappho, Sappho and Pindar were the very well-known Greek lyric poets. Okay, now let's move ahead to discuss the development of lyric during the Middle Ages. The Romans translated the Greek lyric poetry to Latin language, okay, because the mother tongue of the Romans was Latin. So they translated the Greek lyric poetry into their own language, which was Latin, during the classical period, and these poems came to be recited and not sung. Now there was a little change. In the previous times, in the ancient times, the poems were sung, but now these translated poems were not sung, they were recited. But still the meter or the structure of the poem, it remained same as it was there in the ancient times. But later on, after the Middle Ages, in Europe during the period of Renaissance, Renaissance is a movement, okay, which began from Italy and then came to England during the 15th and 16th century. So, during this period of Renaissance, some poets they started writing lyrical poetry, but this poetry was mainly influenced by Greek lyrics or Persian lyrics or Chinese lyrics. In Japan also during the Middle Ages, lyrical poetry was written. They were known as haikus, right? They were known as haikus. So, in Japan, in Greece, in Persia, in China, everywhere, lyric poetry was popular during the Middle Ages. In Italy, if we talk about Italy, Petrarch, Petrarch, Petrarch was a very important poet who contributed to Italian poetry, and he also became an exponent of lyric poetry in his country during the 14th century. But friends, we are the students of English literature. We are not much concerned with what happened in Greek literature, what happened in Roman literature, what happened in Italian literature. Our focus is to discuss and to know what was the origin of lyric, when was the origin of lyric in English literature. So that is the focus now. Now we want to discuss how lyric poetry entered into English literature. See friends, this lyrical poetry came to England. In English literature, it came in the beginning of the period of Renaissance. Renaissance means the beginning of 16th century. During the Elizabethan age, lyrics became very popular. It became so popular during this 16th century that Legois, who is an important critic of English literature, he said about English literature, he said, I quote, England, merry England, was a nest of singing birds. Legois declared England as a nest of singing birds. Why? Because we find hundreds of poets writing beautiful poems, beautiful lyrics during this Elizabethan age, and that's why Elizabethan England is known as the nest of singing birds during 16th century. Lyrics and songs became the order of the day, and mostly the lyrics which you find during the Elizabethan age, they were romantic by nature. So romanticism was an important characteristic of the Elizabethan lyrics in English literature. Actually, these lyrics came from Italy, from Petrarch, that I will discuss later on. But England is considered as the nest of singing birds, and Elizabethan age is also known as the golden period of lyrical poetry. Legois, again I have taken one quotation from the works of Legois. He observes that, and the song was everywhere, sung in the halls and parlors and trolled along the roads. It was in towns and in the country. He wants to say that song was found everywhere. Lyrical songs were found everywhere, in the parlors, in the halls, on the roads, in the town and in the country. Country means villages, on the stage and in romances. Everywhere songs became popular. It filled the whole collections. Some poets specialized in it. Legois wants to say that this lyrical poetry became so popular that some poets achieved mastery over writing the lyrical poetry. England, destitute of plastic arts, became the impatient lover of poems. According to Legois, England became the lover of poems. So, Elizabethan age. During this Elizabethan age, Thomas Wyatt, the Earl of Surrey, he brought the Petrarchan style of writing sonnets, and he introduced this Petrarchan sonnets in English literature in England during the 16th century. So, Thomas Wyatt is considered as an important poet when we are discussing the development of lyric poetry in English literature. So, he was one of the early poets, Thomas Wyatt, who popularized lyric poetry in England. Apart from Thomas Wyatt, we have Robert Southwell, we have the greatest of the great William Shakespeare, Edmund Spenser, who is known as the poet's poet, Sir Philip Sidney, a great lover of poems. All these were the important poets of the Elizabethan age. They started popularizing lyrical poetry during this Elizabethan age. On the screen, you can see the whole list of so many collections, anthologies of lyric poetry which were published in England during this Elizabethan age. These collections, the Paradise of Dainty Devices, published in 1576, then Gorgeous Gallery of Gallant Inventions, then a handful of Pleasant Delights, and so many collections of hundreds of lyrics were published during the Elizabethan age. Okay. Then what happened to lyrics during the 18th century? During the 17th century, after the Elizabethan age, if you come to the beginning of 17th century, in fact friends, the beginning of 17th century is considered as the end of Elizabethan age. Okay, so towards the end of Renaissance period, towards the end of Elizabethan age, you find a drastic change in the nature of poetry which was written now. In the beginning of 17th century, the lyric poetry was rebellious by nature. If you examine the Elizabethan lyric poetry, and then if you examine the 17th century lyric poetry, you find a sharp difference between these two. Okay, what difference? Elizabethan lyric poetry, as I told you, was romantic by nature. Romanticism was an important feature of the Elizabethan lyrical poetry. But if you come to the 17th century lyrical poetry, you find metaphysics, or you find metaphysical lyric poetry. And metaphysics appeals to intellect, and romanticism appeals to your heart. Okay, so that's why one appeals your mind and another appeals your heart. So you have a change in the kind of poetry, kind of lyric poetry which was now written during the 17th century. John Donne, who was the pioneer of this kind of metaphysical poetry, was an important poetry who was writing such lyric poetry in his times. John Donne, Andrew Marvell, Catherine Phillips, and many more were the important poets of lyric poetry during the 17th century. Not only this, we find some devotional poems, divine lyrics written both by John Donne and John Milton during the 17th century. But if you come to the 18th century, friends, 18th century, in one of my videos I have told you that 18th century is the period of prose. It is the period of prose literature in which in the first half of 18th century periodical essays were popular, and in the second half of the 18th century novels became popular. So both periodical essays and novels were prose literature. So lyrics did not enjoy good days during the 18th century. Why? Because the spirit of the people, the desire, the wish of the people was to read only prose literature. James Thomson, however, was a noted poet who kept the fire burning. There were no major lyric poets during those times of 18th century, but James Thomson kept on contributing to English poetry during this 18th century, and James Thomson published his collection of poems which is entitled as The Seasons in 1730. But apart from this, you do not find major contribution by any poets in the field of lyrical poetry. But again, if you come to the 19th century, or if we come to the age of romantic revival is a short period of 32 years in the history of English literature. It begins from 1798 to 1830. So from 1798, that means the end of 18th century, till 1830, that means the beginning of 19th century. These 32 years, a small period, is known as the period of neo-romanticism. It is also known as the period of romantic revival. William Wordsworth started publishing fantastic poetry, fantastic lyric poetry, along with other poets like S.T. Coleridge, P.B. Shelley, John Keats, Lord Byron, William Blake. These were the outstanding lyric poets of this romantic revival of the 19th century. So the beginning of 19th century again brought about a revolution, a new kind of romanticism was found in the lyrical poetry published in the beginning of 19th century. William Wordsworth, who is known as the poet of nature, John Keats, known as the poet of love, S.T. Coleridge, known as the poet of supernatural. These were the masters of writing lyrical poetry in those times. But if you come to the second half of the 19th century, then we have some Victorian poets, because after 1830 till 1900, these 70 years, this period, it's a long period of 70 years. I repeat it again, 1830 to 1900. These 70 years are known as the period of Victorian age. Queen Victoria was ruling on England during this period, and it is known as the Victorian age. During this Victorian age, you need to focus on the contribution of two important poets of English literature, and they are the poet laureate Lord Alfred Tennyson. Alfred Tennyson had been given this title by Queen Victoria, the poet laureate, Raj Kavi. He was the laureate or Raj Kavi of England. Okay. So Lord Alfred Tennyson and Robert Browning, they continued writing this lyrical poetry in the second half of the 19th century. But if you come to the 20th century, T.S. Eliot, the poets like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, they announced the end of lyrical poetry. During the 20th century, you do not find that lyric poetry was flourishing. So that was the whole history of lyric poetry that I have presented before you. At the end, let me conclude the whole discussion that lyric is a short but musical poem written in small stanzas. It expresses the personal emotions or experiences of the poet. In the ancient times, lyric poetry originated in Greek literature. It is called a lyric poetry because it was sung in the company of a musical instrument known as lyre, Lyre. In those times, two kinds of lyric poetry were existing: choral lyric poetry and monodies, right? But later on, it came to English literature in the beginning of 16th century, and Sir Thomas Wyatt popularized this lyrical poetry during 16th century. So from 16th century till 19th century or 20th century, lyric poetry became so popular that it had trillions of lovers in English literature. So friends, here we come to the end of this discussion. If you have any questions or doubts on the definition and origin and development of lyric poetry, do write to me in the comment section of this channel. Tomorrow I will come up with some new topic. Till then, goodbye, stay home, stay safe. Thank you very much.